Hi, everyone. My name is Philip Bloom. I'm the June and Simon Casey Lead Curator of the Chinese Garden at the Huntington. And it's my great pleasure to welcome everyone to the second talk in our fall 2021 lecture series. Thank you all very much for being here, and I'd like to express my particular gratitude to the Justin Vanya Memorial Fund for supporting tonight's lecture and many of our other programs in the Chinese Garden. As you can see, we're still holding our lecture series online, and we will continue to do so through the end of the year and possibly into the spring. As always, the lectures are recorded and they're made available on the Huntington's website a day or two after the talks take place. So many of you probably know that the past few weeks have been a pretty exciting time for the Huntington's Chinese Garden. After 2 years of planning and more than a year of delays, we opened our new art gallery called the Studio for Lodging the Mind. And we've also opened an inaugural exhibition, A Garden of Words, which focuses on the original works of calligraphy and ink on paper that were created as models for the wooden placards, tile or carved tiles and inscribed stones in the garden. Over the course of the 15-year process of building the Chinese Garden, we've commissioned more than 30 contemporary artists from mainland China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, the US, and the UK to brush both name placards and poetic couplets. And the exhibition uses their writings to introduce the art of calligraphy to both English and Chinese reading visitors. The exhibition begins with a discussion of what a Chinese character is and how it communicates meaning. We then look at the materials that are used to write calligraphy, and we show a selection of works that demonstrate the dramatically different visual effects that artists can create just by varying the thickness of their ink or the smoothness of their paper. The third section of the exhibition looks at the 5 major scripts that are commonly used in calligraphy today. And then finally, we look at a few of the ways that artists are trying to innovate within this tradition by looking to the past for inspiration. These physical artworks themselves are complemented with 2 videos, one of which shows a calligrapher writing the same character in all 5 scripts, and another comprising interviews with 8 of the artists who contributed to the exhibition. This latter video provides some insights into how the artists learn calligraphy, how they conceptualize their work, what kind of materials they use, and ultimately what calligraphy really means to them. Of course, I very much hope everyone can visit the exhibition in person, but if not, many of the materials related to the exhibition are available online, as are the 2 videos, and you can find them at the website address on your screen. So as a complement to the exhibition, we've organized this series of lectures, of which tonight's is a part. We're hoping that they will provide some context, both historical and conceptual, to help you better appreciate the art, the remarkable richness of calligraphy. A few weeks ago, Professor Chen Bai of Zhejiang University provided a whirlwind overview of the history of the art form, highlighting some key questions that he, as a practitioner and historian, has yet to answer despite decades of experience. If you missed that talk, it's available online on the Huntington's website. And I think whirlwind will be a key term for tonight's lecture as well, as Dr. Huiwen Lu will take us into the visual drama of wild cursive script, arguably the most energetic and even chaotic style of writing in China. Dr. Lu is an associate professor of art history at National Taiwan University in Taipei. She earned her doctorate in Chinese art history at Princeton and her master's at National Taiwan University. Before taking up her current position, she taught at National Taiwan Normal University, National Tsinghua University, and also Oberlin College. Professor Lu has written probably more widely and more deeply on the history of calligraphy, both in Chinese and English, than maybe any other scholar active today. And it's really an honor that she's able to join us tonight from Taipei. Professor Lu's work spans the Han to Qing dynasties, in other words, more than 2 millennia. She's treated everything from the development of cursive script to the place of forgeries and the history of calligraphy, from the effects of rubbings and prints on calligraphic practice to the theory of calligraphy itself. She's also contributed actively to broader public understanding of calligraphy through her work on exhibitions. As a graduate student, she helped to develop the exhibition and catalog, The Embodied Image Chinese Calligraphy from the John B. Elliott Collection, which 25 years after its publication still remains perhaps the best introduction to the history of calligraphy available in English. As a professor, Dr. Lu has similarly involved her own students in the creation of exhibitions. Most recently, in the spring of 2019, they curated a show whose title I think could be translated like Images in a Mirror, copies of Huisu's autobiography and the transmission of style at the National Taiwan University Library, which brought together a remarkable selection of works of wild cursive script. The centerpiece of that exhibition, the autobiography written by the monk Huisu in 777, I think will be one of the foci of Professor Lu's lecture tonight, Wild Cursive Calligraphy, Poetry, and Buddhist Monks in the 8th century and beyond. So at any time during Professor Lu's talk, please feel free to enter your questions into the Q&A box, which appears either at the bottom or top of your screen, depending on your device. And at the end of the talk, I will pose those questions to Professor Lu. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Huiwen Lu.
Thank you, Philip. It's my honor to be invited to this lecture series. I wish I could be there with you. And from your slide presentation, the gallery installation looks fabulous. Just congratulations to this opening of the gardening and the gallery. Okay, so the title of my talk today is Wild Cursive Calligraphy, Poetry, and Buddhist Monks in the 8th Century and Beyond. And this is a project that I first wrote about in 2010 when I was invited to Chicago University for a conference on the 10th century. And it just opened a window for me through these poems and on wild monks, wild calligraphy, wild cursive calligraphy. And so it just took its own route. And just as Philip mentioned, that I curated with my graduate students this exhibition on this piece of autobiographical essay by monk Huisu and the copies. So the project seems to be growing and still growing. Okay, let me start. So here's a brief review of the development of Chinese script types, from the oracle bones to bronze inscriptions, seal script, clerical script, and standard running and cursive script. And here, usually we say 篆隶楷行草. It seems like it's the order of the development of the script types, but in fact, it's both cursive script and standard script developed from clerical script, and then each of them took its own development. So cursive script in the 4th century, we have Wang Xizhi, the great master of calligraphy. And then in the 8th century, there's a new breed of cursive script. We call it the wild cursive script. And it appeared in the late 7th and the early 8th century. And standard script, running script, the most common script types that we use today that probably most of you are very familiar with. Okay, and this wild cursive script was often accompanied by unruly behavior and exciting performances by the calligraphers, such as shouting and running about while writing. And many of the wild cursive calligraphers were Buddhist monks in the 8th to the 10th century. In written documents of the Tang and Song, it is often called 草圣, marvelous cursive, or 颠草, mad cursive. The most common name today is 狂草, wild cursive, but actually this term 狂草, wild cursive did not appear until about 13th century. and was most commonly used to refer to this type of cursive writing in the 16th century. But today it's the most common name we call this script type. Okay, and the example here is from this piece in the National Palace Museum. It's by a Chan Buddhist monk Huiwen Lu, active in the second half of the 8th century. And it's a collection of poems by his contemporaries praising his calligraphy. And it is now called an autobiographical essay, and it's dated 777. And here we see this very marvelous display of brushwork, not only linking stroke with stroke, but also character with character, and forming an uninterrupted linkage in the lines. And this became, after the 8th century, it became a very important calligraphic style in the history. So in the 11th century, we have Huang Tingjian. And this is in the 16th century, we have Zhu Yuming. And then see here some details from the Zhu Yuming scroll, and splattered dots, and then a very free display of this marvelous work in the strokes and brushwork. And also in the 16th century, we have the great painter and calligrapher Huiwen, also a master of wild cursive script. And of course, in the 17th century, we have Dong Qicheng. Here, this just a few examples of this wonderful lines and gradation in ink and the thickness and thinness of the lines. And in the late 16th century, 17th century, we have Wang Duo and Fu Shan. And so these are just a few examples of the marvelous masters of the wild cursive script. And you can imagine this is very popular with also modern audiences. Like on the NPM, National Palace Museum online shop, there are so many products and like neckties and mugs with the designed with details from this autobiographical essay by monk Huiwen Lu. And even this picture on the left is I took from a hotel room in Shanghai, and I was working on the Huiwen Lu exhibition, and then I went to Shanghai for a conference, and I looked up and saw this frame on the wall with a fraction of this scroll. But it's very interesting. You can see that the lines, the characters were truncated, and it's but it doesn't seem to bother people, because people just appreciate the lines and the composition. And so this might remind you of Jackson Pollock's painting, drip painting, abstract expressionism. But actually, as many scholars have pointed out, like Professor Lederose has pointed out in his wonderful book, 10,000 Things, they look very similar, but actually a piece of wild cursive script calligraphy is still writing. It's still a piece of calligraphy, not like Pollock's painting. He, with a lot of this random dripping and splashing of ink and these lines and colors on the canvas. So with a piece of writing, we can always reverse or relive the process of creation by the calligrapher. So there's a big difference in these abstract paintings and cursive calligraphy. And this is this piece is probably the earliest example we have of this script type around cursive calligraphy. And so today I'll talk about how this script type started in China. First from the 8th century, and then we will go on to the 9th and 10th century, and then to the 11th century, and see how it developed. Okay, so the materials I will use, a large part of it is called the Songs of Cursive Calligraphy, or 草书歌. These are various verses by contemporaneous writers recording the wonders of the wild cursive they witnessed. My talk today will have 3 parts. The first part is craziness, alcohol, and Taoism. That's in the 8th century. And the mad monks' spiritual powers, that's late 8th to the 9th century. And then new developments in the 9th and 10th century. So what I'm trying to do is to show that there's a development of the script type. It's not a static form of art that never changed. Okay, the first part. Emperor Taizong, Tang Taizong of the Tang Dynasty, deeply admired the Eastern Jin calligrapher Wang Xizhi and promoted his style as the ultimate model for calligraphy in the 7th century. The elegant style of Wang's writings in running script and cursive script practically dominated the development of calligraphy during the 1st century of the Tang Dynasty. Wang Xizhi's towering status and profound influence are markedly manifest in this piece by Sun Guoting, called Manual on Calligraphy, 书谱. It's dated 687. This work is a calligraphic masterpiece in the style of Wang Xizhi's cursive script, as well as a treatise acclaiming Wang Xizhi for his unsurpassable standing, both in the art of calligraphy and in terms of moral integrity. And validating calligraphy with Confucian moral cultivation, Sun Guoting explains the marvel of Wang Xizhi's art. So he says there's a very long passage talking about the connection between Confucian teaching and Wang Xizhi's art. And at the end of the passage, Sun Guoting says, this is why the work of Wang Xizhi in his late years is so marvelous, for by then his thoughts were well considered and his intent and breath in perfect harmony and balance. Never agitated, never sharp, Wang's style and demeanor naturally resonate far. This model of a cultivated mind in art, informed by the teachings of Confucius, underwent a drastic change by the middle of the 8th century. A new breed of cursive calligraphy that appealed to speed, emotions, and sensational performances gradually gained popularity. And the first noted master of this new style was Zhang Xu, here, a native of Wuxian, a modern Suzhou in Jiangsu province. Zhang became known for his love of wine and cursive calligraphy during Tang Xuanzong's reign in the 8th century. The great Tang poet Du Fu, in his Song of the 8 Immortals of the Wine Cup, lists Zhang along with Li Bai, the great poet Li Bai, and He Zhizhang, and others as inspired characters in drunkenness. The poem unmistakably makes a connection between Zhang's drinking and writing. And Zhang's biography in the New History of the Tang, Xin Tang Shu, also gives a picture of his extraordinary performance. It says, Xu is a native Suzhou. He is addicted to wine. In drunkenness, he shouts and runs about wildly to write. Sometimes he dips his head in the ink to write with his hair. Looking at his writing after sobering up, he thinks it is divinely marvelous and can never be repeated. People call him Crazy Zhang or Zhang Dian. Other sources say that when the desire to write arose, Zhang hurriedly wrote on clean walls and screens, whether they belonged to him or not. Alcohol spurred his unruly actions and spontaneous act of writing. Works thus produced reportedly conjured up myriad images of nature, ranging from spring water, spring river, winter grasses, running clouds, and frightened dragons to flying cranes, falling flowers, and so on. Zhang's lively and animating performance evokes associations with the act of painting. In a poem praising Zhang Xu's calligraphy, the poet Jiao Ran, 8th century poet Jiao Ran wrote, he is in command of transformation happening in a flesh, capable of depicting shapes and representing objects. The dazzling brilliance of Mr. Zhang is hard to come by again, displaying light silk in the breeze after finishing writing. The gloom and the glow unfold, following the way, images ghostly and fearsome. Such fanatical behavior resembled spirit possession, along with the power to invoke transformation in writing. It suggested a Taoist connection to Zhang Xu's contemporaries. Zhang acquired the name Sprite of Lake Tai, Tai Hu Jing, or Sprite of Dong Wu Jing, and may indeed have practiced Taoism. Unusual actions, often aided by alcohol and viewed as crazy or wild, were also found among a group of Mo ink splashing painters, including Zhang Zhao, Zhang Zhihe, and so on. In record of the record of famous painters, paintings of the Tang Dynasty, Tang Cao Minhua Lu, the 9th century critic Zhu Jingxuan created the class Yiping, here Yiping, or untrammeled, for the peculiar painting style created by these painters, separate from the regular classes of divine, marvelous, and skillful. Paintings of this class, Yiping class, feature spontaneous, disruptive, and rough brushwork and ink splashes. An anecdote of a poor Mo painter, Wang Mo, dipping his head in the ink to paint with his hair coincides eerily with Zhang Xu's story. Zhang Zhao's remarkable ability to simultaneously paint a living branch with one hand and a dead branch on the other correspond to monk shows stunt writing, regular script and cursive script with different hands concurrently. So the way Zhang Zhao ran about and shouted when painting also present a spectacle similar to Zhang Xu's performance. Both wild cursive calligraphy and Yiping painting feature the practices that deviated from traditional and classical methods. Taoism, especially Taoist performance of magical illusion, may have been a major source of inspiration. And a look at the backgrounds of these calligraphers and painters reveals that they were predominantly from the coastal areas of Zhejiang and Jiangsu in southeastern China. And this region had been an important place for Taoism since the Han Dynasty. So this is the beginning of this wild form of calligraphy writing. And later on, it was not until the last years of Zhang Xu's life that Buddhist monks became associated with wild cursive calligraphy. And monk Huiwen, a monk from Linling, Hunan, became known for this art in the second half of the 8th century. Piecing together information from scattered sources, modern scholars are able to paint a rough picture of Huiwen's life. He was ordained at a very young age. Although he bore the title of a monk all his life, he was not confined by Buddhist precepts. He ate meat, drank wine, and dedicated most of his energy to the art of calligraphy. Huaisu learned calligraphy in his homeland of Hunan and became known for his dynamic writing of cursive calligraphy in his 20s. The local magistrate, Wang Yong, was possibly his first major patron. Huaisu reportedly performed at Wang's parties, prompting a group of local notables to write poetry eulogizing the marvels they witnessed. Hoping to gain wider recognition, Huaisu left his homeland for the capital Chang'an in the year 768, when he was in his early 30s, residing there for 4 or 5 years. Returning home, he stopped in Luoyang, where he met with the calligrapher Yan Zhenqing. Details about Huaisu's last decades in Hunan are extremely vague. Presumably, he died there sometime after the year 800. The poems written by some of the Hunan notables in Huaisu's circle form the core of what we know about his calligraphy. More than 30 people reportedly wrote such poems for Huaisu. 11 poems, plus a few fragments by a total of 14 people are extant today. They are often entitled Song of Cursive Calligraphy of Master Huaisu, Huaisu Shangren Cao Shu Ge. These poems form a unique group, sharing many similarities in phrasing and in the spectacles they portray. They describe Huaisu writing in a manner similar to Zhang Xu, wild and drunk, called a mad monk here, Kuang Seng. Huaisu was seen as a successor to crazy Zhang Dian. The poets used analogies to phenomena and objects in both the natural and the human worlds: thunderstorms, blizzards, warfare, falling flowers. Fine gold threads, calligraphy. Okay. According to Qian Qi, a poet, Huaisu's uncle, Huaisu script, his Buddhist practice probably also reached a certain level. In his poem for Huaisu, Zhu Jing wrote, several years after his ordination, Huaisu mastered the spiritual power to know past lives, Tong Su Ming. But one day he turned back to the art of calligraphy. Here I read Tong Su Ming in the original text to be mastering Su Ming Tong, one of the 5 spiritual powers in Buddhism, which are the abilities to see all things, Tian Yan Tong, to hear all things, Tian Er Tong, know the thoughts of all other minds, Ta Xing Tong, know all former existences of self and others, Su Ming Tong, and go anywhere one wishes, Shen Zu Tong or Ru Yi Tong. In Buddhism, these abilities signify liberation from the limits of the physical body at a high level of meditation. Shakyamuni and his disciples allegedly performed these spiritual powers to compete with and ultimately to win over and convert practitioners of other teachings and non-believers. These displays of spiritual powers also include transforming the appearance of objects or invoking illusions at will, rather similar to the illusion magic practiced by various mystical cults. In China, the performance of spiritual powers had been an important part of Buddhism up to the end of the 10th century. During the Tang period, it was particularly associated with the southern sect of Chan teaching and often linked to Kuang-Seng, the mad monks. Clues indicate that Huaisu's contemporaneous recognized the association between his calligraphic performance and mystical or religious practices. Wang Yong mentioned that Huaisu swallows potion and chants mantra. Perhaps he was casting spells. Zhu Jing, another poet, described that while writing, Huaisu's face and body are cast off, 形容脱落 as if aided by the unseen, and his mind roams who knows where. Huaisu's homeland of Hunan was where the Chan master Ma Zu Daoyi in the 8th century and his disciples established a stronghold of the southern sect of Chan teaching during the mid to the late 8th century. And as James Robson's study of Mount Heng, the southern sacred peak, shows, this region was where Taoism and Buddhism met in the Tang. Huaisu's reputation as a mad monk, Huang Seng, and his performance of wild cursive Huang Cao calligraphy, highlighted by startling changes of scenes and atmosphere in the viewer's perception, may have been associated with these religious traditions in Hunan. Since its earliest development in the 6 dynasties, Chinese calligraphic criticism has been loaded with metaphors. The poems eulogizing Zhang Xu and Huaisu's calligraphy not only inherited this tradition, but expanded upon it. One of the most important differences is the increase in the number of verbs used to describe their works, emphasizing movements and forces rather than presenting a static picture. This, of course, could be attributed in part to the dynamic actions of writing carried out by Zhang Xu and Huaisu. A perhaps more crucial reason for the vivid descriptions probably lies in the animated and illusionistic effects contained in their works. Huaisu's performance was possibly even more intense and richer in variations than Zhang Xu's. In addition to common analogies to blowing winds, sudden rains, and flying dragons, many authors of the various poems entitled Song of the Cursive Calligraphy of Master Huaisu describe widely disparate images and sudden changes of scenes and atmospheres. So here are just a few examples of these metaphors in these poems. But many of the poems emphasize the sudden changes of scenes in the atmosphere. For example, Dai Shu Lun, this poem mentions a rapid change from the flowering late spring to a scene of soaring dragons and standing beasts. Ren Hua here juxtaposes the image of a gigantic whale shaking an island and the waves produced by the force of its wake, with one of long snakes rushing into a clump of shrubs. Zhu Jing here describes rights of dead pines cling to a high cliff side by side with seagulls startled by the turning waves. Rather than taking these animated images to be mere rhetoric, I consider them to be an intensified manifestation of the illusionistic changes and transformations in wild cursive calligraphy. Around Huaisu's time, several other Buddhist monks also excelled at the wild cursive, as we know through songs praising their art. Not all of them needed the aid of alcohol. In this poem, seeing of Master Xian returning to Mount Lu, the poet Meng Jiao, Jiao Ran, makes it clear that the mad monk Master Xian did not need wine to perform magical calligraphy. Things changed as his fingers moved, clouds gathered and rained when he rapidly began to write, and the weather cleared up when he stopped to wash his inkstone. In the end, this poet pleads with Master Xian to stop writing, lest the horrifying waves conjured up by his writing capsized boats. The stormy weather here seems to be not simply a metaphor for the master's brushwork, but something physically felt by the spectator. Without the aid of alcohol, Master Xian may thus have performed some sort of spiritual power or illusion magic in writing cursive calligraphy, or more precisely, may have been believed to do so by his spectators. The notion that Buddhists are good at magical illusion was not entirely unfounded. The magic tricks, huan, popular in folk plays and performances, including turning sprays of water into fish and dragons, cutting off one's limbs, gouging one's belly, and so on, had their origins in Central Asia and even more distant land of India, as recorded in the institutional history of the Tang Dynasty, Tang Huiyao. These tricks had first come to China during the 2nd century BCE in the Western Han period, and were revived at the beginning of the 7th century of the Tang period, when exchanges with Central Asia resumed. In dislike of their appalling stunts, Emperor Gaozong, Tang Gaozong, forbade the performers to come over the border. In the late 8th to the early 9th century, this impression probably overlapped with that of the Chan Buddhist monks, and both sharing a common geographical origin in India and both coming to China through Central Asia. The image of Huaisu, Gaoxian, and Master Xian as Buddhist monks performing magical calligraphy may have come into existence partly because of this conflation. In terms of the technique and pattern of action, however, these Buddhist monks had in their wild cursive writing unmistakable ties with their Taoist predecessors, including Zhang Xu, He Zhizhang, and the Yi Ping painters. Multiple identities and layers of meaning thus coexisted and worked on one another. None of Huaisu's works on walls and scenes is available today. We are left with only a few pieces by him written on paper and silk, including this famous scroll in the Palace Museum. These works on paper and silk represent another aspect of Huaisu's art, and it is they that shape the understanding of Huaisu in later generations. In fact, this scroll is a collection of these songs of cursive calligraphy. Okay. Now into the 9th and the 10th centuries. According to a poem by Ren Hua describing Huaisu's popularity in the capital, Huaisu's trip there in search of fame resulted in much success. Notables and officials offered him luxurious rides and accommodations where he could write on newly prepared screens and walls. The recognition Huaisu received, however, was meager compared to that of his successors in the 9th and 10th centuries. Sometime after the revival of the Buddhism in 846, following the disastrous persecution of the Buddhist law in the preceding years, monk Gaoxian here was called in front of the Tang Emperor to perform cursive calligraphy. And the emperor bestowed the purple robe designated for officials of the highest ranks on him as a sign of recognition. About 5 decades later, during Emperor Zhao Zong's reign, 2 other monks, Ya Xi and Bian Guang, received the same honor for performing cursive calligraphy before the throne. Ya Xi even received the purple robe twice. He was so proud of the privileges that he once wrote a quatrain asserting his confidence. So here he says, "My divine brush methods came from the Buddhist learning. With them, I visited His Highness in Chang'an. Do not be surprised that I'm high-spirited and vigorous. My cursive writing delighted the wise ruler." Emperor Zhaozong was so pleased with Bian Guang's performance, Bian Guang, that in addition to honoring him with a purple robe, he offered him a position in the Hanling Academy. Besides receiving recognition from the court, Bian Guang collected a considerable number of poems and essays written by literary notables in praise of his calligraphy. Like the various poems entitled Song of Cursive Calligraphy of Master Huaisu, written nearly a century and a half earlier, many of these were possibly composed at a gathering, this time to see Bian Guang off on his journey home to Zhejiang from the capital. The total number of these poems reportedly reached about 50, but only a small fraction can still be tracked down. The authors described lively and speedy performances of writing on the walls. They also made connections to Zhang Xu and He Zhizhang, inserting Bian Guang into the Tang lineage of wild cursive writers beginning in the 8th century. Critical differences, however, existed between the two groups of cursive calligraphers about 150 years apart. Poems and essays on the wild cursive calligraphers in the 8th century generally emphasized their craziness and madness, whereas fairly few descriptions of unusual and shocking behaviors are found in writings on those in the late 9th and early 10th centuries. In their place is praise for the honors the calligraphers received from the court. As the art of wild cursive calligraphy obtained validation from the political and social establishments, what transformations did it undergo in its substances and significance? In a song of cursive calligraphy by Master Bian Guang, Guanxiu, another monk, compare the three popular artistic pursuits of Buddhist monks, poetry, painting, and cursive calligraphy in an illuminating way. So here, Guanxiu says, the holy man loves poetry, but it's constrained. He enjoys painting, but considers it limited. Only the art of the wild cursive stays above them all, calling for only a clasp of the mountain spring. Guanxiu preferred wild cursive calligraphy to poetry and painting, essentially for the freedom it allowed. Seemingly following the same thread of thought, Wu Rong, another poet, in another poem for Bian Guang, declared that the seal script Zhuanshu is austere and plain, the clerical Li Shu vulgar, but the cursive Cao Shu praiseworthy for being unrestrained. When measured against the other arts pursued by the Chan monks, the wild cursive suddenly lost its mystical sensation. This situation was radically different from that in the time of Huaisu, who attributed his creativity to supernatural powers and claimed that he had no idea how the calligraphy was accomplished. This change in perception of wild cursive writing from its being unattainable by human power to its being a skill that could be managed and learned probably first occurred in the mid-9th century. The 9th century monk calligrapher Gao Xian appears in contemporaneous records as a rigorous master of both Buddhist and calligraphic practices. He often wrote calligraphy on white linen in the regular as well as the cursive script for people who wished to learn his brush methods. Gao Xian even had a disciple called Jian Zhong, who was known for cursive calligraphy in the old master's style. Unfortunately, not a single work by the 10th century monks is available today, but we do have a scroll by Gao Xian, of Gao Xian's calligraphy here on the screen, 10,000 characters essay in the Shanghai Museum. It features coarse brushwork in disregard of details, alternation of dry and wet ink, and some bold and unusual character structures but can hardly be described as wild or crazy in any sense. It is this quality of roughness and crudeness implying liberation from the confinements of traditional calligraphy that one praises from Guanxiu and Wurong in their poems. While cursive calligraphy essentially went from a magical act to merely being an artistic style. This style of wild cursive calligraphy was severely criticized during the Northern Song. Okay, here, and also there's a comparison with this painting, the two patriots, one of the two patriots in the style of Shi Ke, the 10th century painter. And here the robe of the patriot, this zigzagging form of the lines and the coarse presentation with the brush is very similar to Gao Xian's calligraphy. This style, very rough and crude style of wild cursive calligraphy was severely criticized during the Northern Song period. The most common comments were that it was vulgar, 俗, lacking refinement and taste, 粗鄙, and only suitable for hanging in the wine shop. Evidence that this last opinion was acted upon is indeed found in Song paintings. For example, a partial view of a screen decorated with looping lines, not unlike the cursive writing of appears in the wine shop in the scroll watermill here. You can see through these beams. And there's a screen here with the looping lines. An interesting detail from along the river during the Qingming festival, Qingming Shanghe Tu, in the Palace Museum, Beijing, also shows a piece of fabric with cursive calligraphy in a similar style covering the donkey cart in the painting. While cursive calligraphy also seems to have been a popular decoration motif for residential interiors during this period, many wall paintings of the Northern Song tombs excavated from central China show screens decorated with cursive writing. For example, like this one from Baisha in Henan, and this one, another Northern Song tomb from Dengfeng, Henan. Apparently, this was quite popular among the general public. The Northern Song masters of calligraphy never hesitated to show their disdain for this fashionable style and countered it in their own ways. Su Shi rarely engaged in writing the wild cursive. Mi Fu returned to the classical tradition of Wang Xizhi. Only Huang Tingjian still practiced Kuangcao wild cursive, but developed a completely different aesthetic. Huaisu's autobiographical essay was the most important source of inspiration for Huang Tingjian's wild cursive. But Huang replaced Huaisu's fluidity and swiftness with something else. Professor Peter Sturman has done a fine job of analyzing Huang's revised version of this art. Huang Tingjian's this piece called Sayings of a Chan Buddhist Monk, for example, emphasizes the importance of generating tension in calligraphy. The lines are crooked and bent. The characters carefully structured and positioned to create variations. This style was written at a much slower pace and demands a slower appreciation of the work. Huang's style requires control and discipline, and he essentially, I quote Peter Sturman's sentence, transforms a tradition of writing that had become synonymous with drunken, unfettered ease and public exhibition exhibitionism into an intensely meditative practice. So this piece, also you see these lines painted and cooked. It takes a lot of time to execute, and it's done in a much slower speed than the lines we see in Huaisu's work. In addition, Huang discarded the tradition of writing the 1,000-character essay in wild cursive and carefully chose which text to transcribe. His favorite texts included poems by the Tang poet Liu Yuxi, who had also suffered banishment from the court. The account of Lian Po and Lin Xiangru from a record of the grand historian Shi Ji, which tells a story of political retaliation due to personal feuds and Chan sayings that Huang Tingjian's own religious belief. Now, in Huang Tingjian's hand, it is a self-conscious artistic pursuit. Huangcao calligraphy had come a long way since the 8th century. And Emperor Huizong, Song Huizong, was the last Huangcao master of the Northern Song. His 1,000-character essay, now in the Liaoning Provincial Museum, shows yet another twist. The fact that the emperor himself transcribed the 千字文 1,000-character essay in the wild cursive seems at first glance to indicate a revival of the old tradition of the late Tang and 5 dynasties. But his style is clean and polished, a far cry from the coarseness and strangeness that characterized the major Huangcao masters of the earlier period. More than anything else, it was the new literati taste in Huangcao represented by Huang Tingjian's promotion of Huaisu that shaped the emperor's work. At the same time, though, Huizong's scroll is a forthright claim of his identity as the sovereign king, measuring more than 11 meters long and drawn with dragons and clouds in gold in the background. You see very clearly here. These are dragons were painted with gold. The scroll is made of a single piece of paper. There's no joint in this scroll, a dazzling display of fine craftsmanship in the imperial workshop. Here, the wild cursive is neither a mad, untrammeled performance of supernatural powers, nor the melancholic self-reflection of a frustrated scholar official, but simply an elegant courtly pursuit. So here we see from the 8th to the 11th century, from Zhang Xu to Emperor Huizong of the Northern Song, while cursive calligraphy underwent several phases of change. During the first half of the 8th century, when the model of Wang Xizhi reached the peak of its standing and influence, there emerged the wild cursive, a style that revolted against the established ideals. Zhang Xu created astounding images with drunken brush, and along with the Yiping painters, broke new ground outside the orthodoxy. Although closely associated with Taoism in its origin, this new form of art was allied with the southern sect of Chan Buddhism in the second half of the 8th century, out of which came the mad monk Huaisu and his calligraphic performance. Linked with Shen Tong spiritual powers as the stereotype conception of a Chan monk, Shen Tong, and wild cursive trinity continued to intensify in the 9th and 10th centuries. Chan monks with the expertise of writing wild cursive, including Gao Xian, Bian Guang, Ya Xi, and Guan Xiu, soon gained recognition from the court. In their hands, however, the wild cursive went from being a magical act unattainable by human power to a specialized skill that was manageable through learning, like poetry and painting. Ironically, the wild cursive began its course of secularization just when Chan monks became its main practitioners, and the art lost its creativity. when untrammelled became institutionalized. Some might see these changes as a sign of a dreadful decline. Yet from the perspective of the development of calligraphy in the long term, the transformation of the wild cursive during the 9th and 10th centuries was vital to its further growth. The wild cursive now had a concrete framework and content, no matter how uninspired we may find them, for calligraphers to work on, to comprehend, to maneuver, and to rebel against. Although the Northern Song masters, including Su Shi, Mi Fu, and Huang Tingjian, disdained the monk calligraphers of the 10th century, their reforms of the wild cursive in the following century, in fact, built on that foundation. From then on, the wild cursive retained great capacity for artistic expressions as a personal identity, intention, and choice of historical models varied in the hands of individual calligraphers, and making it one of the most important styles in the history of Chinese calligraphy. Just as the many examples I showed you at the beginning of this lecture from the 11th century, 15th century, 16th century, 17th century, all these different ways of working on this a form of wild cursive. So that's about it for my lecture. I think that's all I have prepared.
Thank you very, very much for that illuminating lecture, Professor Lu. So I wanted to start with a couple of pretty basic questions. Do you know anything about what kind of brushes these different calligraphers were using? Is there any change in, or other materials for that matter, is there any change in particularly the type of brush that calligraphers were using to write wild cursive script from the 8th century onward?
The kind of brush?
Yeah.
They look from, judging from the pieces we have today, the kind of brush they use are not very much different from what they use. Probably they used for other script types. For the piece of autobiographical essay by monk Huiwen Lu, the 8th century piece in the National Palace Museum, it's a very fine and line, and so probably the brush, they're all made of animal hair, but it's a more stiff kind of animal hair. So it's probably with lang hao or what's it called?
Weasel hair.
Yeah. So, but they're not too different from what they used for other script types.
And then I also was wondering, you mentioned many times the writing of wild cursive script on walls. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if in writings about calligraphy, whether practitioners ever talk about the difference between writing vertically and writing horizontally. It seems like it certainly requires a different physical position to do so, but it also could potentially affect how they go about composing a work or actually executing. I wondered if there's any discussion of that.
No, I don't. Usually the spectators would describe what they saw. They saw very fast movements, or the calligrapher would just suddenly stood up and then shouting and then started right on the wall. And then they could not, they even didn't have time to scream, and the calligrapher had finished. And so it's a performance. So it's a performance. So it's for people to gather around to see, to look at. So I suppose the characters are quite large, and the fast speed, of course, and also you don't see a lot there. You cannot, I mean, there's not much details to look at, or there's very minute changes in the lifting and tilting or things like that. But this coarse, very splash of very fast speed of writing. So I think it's the size and also the speed, but they didn't mention much about the position of writing on the wall or writing on the piece of paper in your hand.
And I also, this is probably a very naive question, but when you look at the extant works by Huiwen Lu and Gao Xian, just kind of visually, how do those compare to what you're reading about in the poems? You know, as you mentioned, these poems really seem to be about performances that are more public. They're very likely writing larger characters. The brushwork probably isn't quite as detailed as you might find in the extant works on paper. But I just was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the extant works and what you see in them.
In the scrolls?
Yeah.
As I mentioned in the lecture, that the only things we have left of them were not those written on the walls or screens. There was a few records in Tang period recording, well, writing on the walls or screens was a common practice in pre-Tang calligraphy. So there is not necessarily Huangcao cursive. It's probably a large character of a seal script. And then in the Tang records, we know people will carve out that piece of wall and take it down and preserve it. So that's a specific type of writing, but unfortunately we don't have anything left of them. And I mentioned that what we have left on the silk and paper are a different type of writing by these same calligraphers. So that they recorded all these wonderful scenes of great performances, but we don't see those in those pieces. We have to, so for the works on the silk and paper, we see a lot of these detailed use of the brush, a lot of fine thickening and thinning, and a change of ink tones. So we appreciate them as a piece on paper and silk. So it's just, yeah, unfortunately we don't.
They're just two totally different genres and styles of writing, and not very comparable. Okay. So one person has asked how the calligraphers you talked about today supported themselves. So did they get paid for these the kinds of writings you were talking about today? Some of them were monks, so presumably they were supported through their monasteries, but were they selling their works? Did they have patrons? How did that work?
I think we don't have many records about this, but I think like for Huiwen Lu, one of his earliest patrons was a magistrate in his homeland. So it's a local 地方官. And so probably like, it's like, so he invited, is this magistrate who invited all these guests to his residence and also have Huiwen Lu there to do the performance. And so I think this is kind of making Huiwen Lu one of the special local prides of this place. Yeah, and then he continued to Chang'an, to the capital, and we know that he had a lot of patrons who invited him to their houses and he could just paint and then, or not paint, he could write and then, yeah. So yeah, I think I'm not really sure what kind of so probably for the patrons, it's like I have this very marvelous guest, and then I have my friends over, and to show them, and for yeah.
Great. Someone else has asked, do people today still read wild cursive script fluently? So if we suddenly were to discover a new piece of wild cursive script in an archaeological excavation, would someone like you immediately be able to decipher it?
Yeah.
And if so, how did you learn to do that?
Okay, so it's called wild cursive script. It's not actually wild. It's defined by very strict rules. So these are writings, and 草书 cursive writing has its own regulations. So there are a lot of these manuals and textbooks for young students to learn how to write cursive writing, cursive script. So all these lines, looping lines, they look like, but they're not random forms or random paintings. They follow a strict rule to write. And so in this past summer, I led a workshop for a group of graduate students in Zurich. They wanted to learn how to read inscriptions. So we just discovered there are so many textbooks and manuals for people to learn how to recognize and to write cursive script. And this is something that I find very intriguing. Okay, so while cursive script calligraphy, it looks like one of the most free and untrammeled art forms in traditional Chinese painting and calligraphy, but actually it's defined or limited by this very strict regulations. So there's this question of limits versus creativity. Do you see creativity in this very strict limits? And then does it stop creativity, or it fosters creativity? And that's an interesting question, but I don't think there's an easy answer to that.
Great. Thank you. Someone else has asked about the relationship of poetry and calligraphy. So were the calligraphers writing their own poems? Were they typically writing poems that they had learned from elsewhere? Can you talk a little bit more? You mentioned briefly in your talks some of the content of the calligraphy, but could you talk more about that relationship?
Sometimes they write their own poems, but a lot of times they would transcribe ancient poems, old poems by famous poets, or transcribe essays, famous essays from famous authors. So it depends. It's a lot of different situations. There's a very interesting article by Robert Harris in the catalog Embodied Image about reading Chinese calligraphy. Because in the West, usually we are encouraged to appreciate calligraphy without knowing the contents, without reading them. But in fact, it's the contents or what the calligrapher transcribes is actually a very important part of his writing, and also a very important part for us to fully appreciate the work.
You mentioned several of the different kinds of surfaces on which calligraphers were writing. I think you mentioned working on linen at some point. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What was that work exactly, and how unusual was it to use linen?
So calligraphers in China, they write on paper and silk and different kinds of silk. And linen is mentioned in the in this record describing the art of Gaoxian, but we don't have his work left. We don't have that piece of calligraphy done on paper. So we don't have the actual example of this linen, this work written on linen.
This is a totally naive question, but are there extant examples of works of calligraphy on linen? I'm assuming there must be. What is it like to write on linen? It's not a material I'm very familiar with.
I don't know any example, but I suppose not. It's probably similar to, well, actually, well, linen is actually different from silk, but I suppose it's kind of same kind of, right on textiles. It's not
Sure.
on paper.
Let's see. So in the process that you've described of transforming cursive script into a manageable and attainable skill, did text start to appear that recorded how people could actually attain or learn that skill? Are there any descriptions of the processes of practicing and learning cursive script from the time period that you were discussing today?
Mm-hmm. Well, for the first generations of the wild cursive, like Zhang Xu and Huaisu, we don't have their like manuals, or
Sure.
we don't know that they had any disciples, and we don't know their masters. Like Huaisu said, he learned from Yan Zhenqing, but was it apparently he did not learn cursive from Yan Zhenqing. And so it's like they just happened to be this vessel for the unseen forces, and they performed wild cursive. But for the second and third generations of this script type, we know that they have mentors and they have disciples, and there are actually manuals attributed to them, teaching students how to write calligraphy. And so that's what I meant by the art became a learnable and manageable skill. And also we see in their works, you see at first glance, they are like splattered lines and dots. But if you look closely, you can see repeated patterns like zigzagging, and then the variations of the ink tones, they're not that large. So you see a difference from the first generations and the second and the third generation. There's a difference in that. You start to see a pattern repeating.
Great. Would you mind sharing your screen again and showing us one of the first slides you showed that had the same character in multiple different script types?
Okay.
We would just like to compare what a character looks like in standard script versus in wild cursive. So could you just describe a little bit what's going on in between standard script and then the cursive version?
Okay, here.
Yep.
So oracle bone, bronze inscription, seal script, and the clerical script. And starting from the clerical script, we see the working of a soft brush. So here you see, especially this last stroke, see this the force on pressing down the brush against the paper and then lifting it up. So you have this thickening and thinning lines. And then here in the Kaisu standard script, you see these different shapes of the lines. Here you have to stop and then press your brush down a little bit and lift it up and go, and then press it down and turn back. And here also press down and go back, come back to the center and come down. And then here stop and then put back the brush tip and back a little bit and then do this kicking movement. And then also here the knot stroke. Then starting with a thin line and then pressing down and then lifting up. So here there's a lot of working, requires a lot of work in the calligrapher's hand. And here 行书 is you connect all these strokes together and write it in a faster speed. And then with 草书, 草书, okay, 草书, 行书, sometimes they're very close. And then here, the wild cursive, it's you see the calligrapher not connects stroke with stroke, but also character with character. So they form an interrupted line from the top to the bottom. Oh, here. So here, and then sometimes it's also this great variation of the size of the characters. Some are very small and some are very large. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. So maybe we'll do two final questions. So one is, was cursive script always considered aesthetically pleasing, or was it ever considered ugly calligraphy, 丑书? And would you be able to comment on the ugly calligraphy, 丑书 phenomenon in the history of Chinese calligraphy?
Okay, so this type of wild cursive, it started in the 8th century, and it was against the classical and very elegant style of cursive represented by the Wang Xizhi tradition. So the Wang Xizhi tradition, each stroke, each character stands on its own. So there are these abbreviations and linkages of strokes within the character, but they don't connect characters together. And then starting with this wild cursive, you connect things together. And also with that, those descriptions of very wild behavior. It's so different from the ideal of the Confucian teaching, like never agitated, very peaceful, very contained. So that's at its inception, it's something against the established orthodox. And so it was like these outcast figures doing outcast, very strange calligraphy. But then it gradually became institutionalized and very popular with the mainstream. And the literati, so Northern Song scholars started to feel, oh, this is so vulgar, so only suitable for the wine shops. But then they transformed it into something else. So it's with this, what is ugly, what is beautiful, or what is valuable, what is not valuable. It always depends on who's talking, and then what kind of situation or historical context that these people faced. So I don't think there's a fixed answer to what is beautiful and what is ugly in calligraphy or any kind of art.
Thank you. And so many people have thanked you for your excellent lecture. And one person asks, what are you currently working on? And would you mind sharing your current research topics with us?
Okay. Well, I'm very interested in this transformation from Tang to Song. So for example, this project also touches upon this subject. In the Tang period, this wild cursive, these art unattainable by human power, but became something with you can control, you can you can have your ideas and your personal belongings in the art. So that's from tongue to song. And so with this case, it's the wild cursive, but also I did another case on regular script, and also the perception of the great calligrapher Wang Xizhi, different perceptions of him in the Tang period and in the Song period. So I'm very interested in this transformation from Tang to Song. And also a more recent topic that I'm working on is the Guanzhong area, central Shanxi. That's where the old capital Chang'an is. So the Tang capital Chang'an is in Shanxi, but in the northern Song, it became the old capital. And so how the Song people, northern Song people, perceived the remains, cultural remains from the previous dynasty. So that's something I'm also working on.
Great, thank you very much. I'll very much look forward to reading your future work. So I just would like to thank you again for your excellent lecture, and so many people have shared my gratitude to you for sharing your work with us. Just before we go, I'd like to remind everyone we do have 2 more lectures in the series this fall. In October, Professor Amy McNair will be talking about calligraphy in the Lingering Garden, Liuyuan in Suzhou. And then in November, Professor Peter Sturman will also be talking about wild cursive script, but wild cursive script in the Ming Dynasty by the artist Huiwen. So I very much hope everyone can join us for those 2 further lectures. And we also will have a demonstration of calligraphy in the Chinese Garden on October 16th by Terry Yuan, and a demonstration in April by Tang Qingyan, who does do a kind of wild cursive script, and I imagine he probably will demonstrate it then. So thank you again so much, Professor Lu, for joining us and for sharing your research. And I'll hope to see you in person at the garden next time.
Thank you, Philip, and thank you, everyone. Have a nice night.
You too. Thank you.
Bye-bye.